Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever it is that you are in the world. Today's topic is understanding and challenging ableism with somatic practices with Alex Yantafi. Alex is a family therapist, certified gender specialist, certified sex therapist, SEP, clinical supervisor, and author. Alex is the author of Gender Trauma, Healing Cultural, Social, and Historical Gender Trauma, and co-author of the books How to Understand Your Gender, a practical guide for exploring who you are, Life Isn't Binary, Hell Yeah, Self-Care, a trauma-informed workbook, and How to Understand Your Sexuality, a practical guide for exploring who you are with Meg John Barker. They also host the podcast Gender Stories. We will have time at the end of the presentation today for Q&A. And so we do ask that you put any questions that you may have in the chat for Alex to view. Since we do have a lot of participants today, we may not be able to have the opportunity for people to raise their hand and come on screen. So if you can put them in the chat, that would be amazing. And you can do that at any time throughout the presentation as your curiosity comes up. And then we'll be able to address those towards the end. Just a quick orientation for Zoom. We do have live transcripts on. Those are available to you if you would like to use them. Also, we will have a recording of this available on our website for free because this is part of our anti-oppression series. So you won't be receiving a link to the recording. It will actually be available on our website, and we'll put that in the chat so that you know where to look to find it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me to talk about this topic. I'm really excited. I'm a disabled person myself, as well as having worked with a lot of disabled clients over the years and supervisees as well in my clinical practice. So this is a topic really near and dear to my heart. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And I'm going to go back to the first slide. There we go. So we are talking about understanding and challenging ableism today. I am probably not going to do the topic complete justice in 90 minutes. And some of what I'm going to be sharing might feel really introductory if you're already pretty familiar with kind of disability studies or kind of disability justice frameworks, but I never make the assumptions that people know some of this stuff just because it is not really widely talked about in most training programs of whatever ilk, if that makes sense, whether it's body workers or mental health providers. I find that this is not often part of the curriculum, so I always include some pretty introductory stuff. So if you are more familiar with the topic, I still hope that you can find something of value today. As a somatic provider, I always like to start from breathing and settling whenever I present. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to invite you into some breathing, settling, and connecting. And please participate as you feel able. And don't worry if that's not really where you are today either. I find it helps me. And sometimes participants find it helpful to be a little more present as we rush through our day from meeting to meeting in our Zoom lives. So I'm going to invite you to just breathe. I know we breathe all the time, but we don't always pay intentional focus, intentional attention to our breathing. So you can soften your eyes if you want to. You don't have to do anything special. You don't have to close your eyes if you don't want to. And all you're doing is breathing. And just saying hello to our bodies. How are you doing right now? Are there places where you're holding tension? You're feeling pretty relaxed? Is there anything that would help you feel a little bit more comfortable right now? Whether it's like a gentle stretch or grabbing a pillow, settling in your chair, whatever it is that might help you feel a little more settled in the here and now. And as you breathe, see if you can notice that place where your body makes contact with the support underneath you, whether it's a chair, couch, bed, the floor. Where is that place where your body touches the support underneath you? And can you feel the point of contact? And as you notice that point of contact between your body and the support underneath you, with as much curiosity and as much non-judgment as you're able, as you check in with your body, see if you can let yourself be supported by gravity, by the support underneath you, just a little bit more. And again, just notice how it feels. Might feel comfortable, uncomfortable, neutral, to just let yourself be held by gravity, which holds us here on this good green earth, which at least where I am is starting to be green again. And as you start to notice gravity and the support underneath you, I'm going to invite you to notice the ground underneath that support, and maybe your feet are on the ground and you can notice those. But really, just let's take a moment to acknowledge the ground we're on, the land we're on. Acknowledging that wherever we are on the globe, we're always on Indigenous land. And breathing in whatever relationship to indigeneity or not we might have to the place that we're on right now. Breathing in all the complexity or ease or anything else that might be there. Then I'm going to invite you to take one more breath into the ancestral web that holds us. We're not the first to do this work, and hopefully we will not be the last. And I know that I'm going to be leaning on the ancestral web of disability activists who've come before me and who've made this work possible and who've made my life possible. And I know that connecting with the ancestral web can be complex, so only connect to those ancestors that you feel comfortable with, even if they are just ancestors of lineage or healing or practice. And again, just noticing how it feels to connect to that web. Then I'm going to take one more breath into the hope that this work is going to be of service to all those who are touched by your work. And the ripples that come from there, sometimes for more than one generation. And finally, breathing back into your body. If you have been kind of maybe taken farther away from it, as we've been breathing into all those connections. Breathing into this body, this moment, doing what you need to do to bring yourself back to presence. Maybe looking around and noticing something that feels neutral, comforting, or pleasant. It can be as simple as a color or a shape or a glass of water. Just noticing the resource that's just there for you and taking it in. And then noticing this Zoom room that we're in, that we come together in to do this work together today. Thank you for taking time to breathe with me and connect and arrive. I really appreciate you doing that with me in whatever capacity you had today. So welcome again. Like I said, where I am on Dakota Anishinaabe land, currently known as Duluth, Minnesota, we're finally starting to see some green. I saw my first daffodils today, even though there's still a little bit of snow on the ground. And I hope spring is also coming back to wherever you are. So what are we going to be talking about today? I'm going to try in the time we have together to really start from why do we need to talk about ableism and disability within somatic practices. I then want to really talk a little bit about kind of the experiences of disabled folks within dominant culture, and particularly focus on infantilization, desexualization, and vilification, because I think that those are particularly salient to a lot of the trauma work that we do. Then I'm going to talk a little bit very briefly about different models of disability, and really talk a little bit more about ableism and what that looks like in practice, before really focusing in on somatic practices and ableism. I'm going to kind of, towards the end, really end with introducing kind of disability justice principle, talking a little bit more about the disability justice framework, and finish up with an invitation to change our thinking and not just our practices when it comes to disability and ableism. And my plan is to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion, but please do put your questions as we go in the chat. And if it's a question for clarification, I will try to keep an eye on the chat, but otherwise we'll hopefully have plenty of time for discussion at the end. Ready. And I have a couple of videos as well that we're gonna watch together. The video is subtitled, and the slides, I'm gonna send the slides to SEI, so they're gonna accompany the video, I believe. So you don't need to kind of write things down. Plus the slides are really like more of a placeholder for me to keep me on track, so that I don't go into many directions with my wonderful brain that can jump from place to place. So why do we even need to talk about disability within our field, right? Well, disabled folks, we make up for a lot of the population globally. Globally, we make the 15% of the global population. That's about 1 billion people who live with a disability in one way or another. And then in the US, I think those are the most recent kind of CDC statistics. It is estimated that about 61 million adults in the United States live with a disability. That means that 1 in 4 adults live with a disability in the United States. And that's just people that have been diagnosed, right? And so that's not even all the folks who might be struggling with chronic health issues for years and years, who might not have a diagnosis. So the number is likely much higher. The percentage of people living with disability is highest in the South in the United States. We could talk a lot about how systemic issues like poverty, racism, misogyny kind of interact with ableism, but that would be like its own kind of webinar, I feel. So this is really just to give you a sense of, we need to talk about this, because even though we are the largest minority when talking about minoritized populations, often disability is not talked about, or when it's talked about, it's also talked about in isolation, right? It's not talked about in terms of how it intersects with other ways in which we are gendered and racialized and classed and normed kind of in our world, in dominant culture. And so disability is really pervasive. And it's no surprise that a lot of clients come to us with a lot of chronic health issues, right? If it's 1 in 4, and that's just of people we know, and it's probably much higher, most of our clients often are facing kind of chronic health issues when they come to us. And so I think it's really important to talk about disability within the context of somatic practices. And of course, we're, most of us, all of us are somatic experiencing practitioners or students of some kind here. And it's even in our curriculum, right? We talk about syndromes. If you're a student, you haven't gotten there yet, you will talk about syndromes at some point in your training in SC, which makes a lot of sense because trauma truly lives in the body. And so we already know that people who have higher A scores, that adverse childhood events measure, we already know that people who have high A scores often kind of literally have years shaved off our lives. If that trauma is unresolved in the body, we know that trauma and the allostatic load of trauma really has an impact on our body. And yes, the videos, I see the question, the videos played will be a part of the recording too. And there's also links on the slide and they're freely available on YouTube. So just answering the question in the chat, sorry. And so, it is no surprise that so many of our clients are dealing with chronic health issues. So many of our clients are dealing with what could be classed as a disability, whether they identify as disabled or not, which of course some clients might not because of the stigma that's pervasive in our dominant culture and how disability is perceived, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So many of our clients, I think, come to us because of chronic pain issues, maybe even more so for those of us who are body workers, but I know even as a mental health provider, that is very true. One of my clients, when we kind of finished working together, said to me, don't get me wrong, I feel that, my mental health has improved, but also my physical health, which is not what I expected by coming to see a mental health provider, because I really truly believe in that kind of holistic approach. And I think all of us do, which is why we're kind of training or working somatically. So we know there is a strong connection between trauma and health. We know that trauma can literally take years off our lives. And we know that we also don't need to have experienced just individual trauma through something like that's measured through the ACE, but also the systemic trauma has a deep impact on kind of our lives. And we know that populations who are impacted by historical trauma, such as indigenous populations, for example, LGBTQ populations and so on, have higher levels of depressions and anxiety and substance use, and that can lead to chronic health issues as well. And like I said, it is part of our curriculum, and yet I also feel that it's kind of a double-edged sword. Often clients come to us because they have chronic health issues, and sometimes they're met in a way that it's healing. And sometimes if we're not careful, they might be met with something that I call the impact of wellness culture. And what I mean by wellness culture is really this idea that if we take really good care of ourselves, then we are, we're going to feel well and we're going to be able to live up to the standards set by capitalism, right? And all of that. And again, that could be a whole other webinar in itself. But if we are not careful, I think often our clients are coming searching for the answer, especially if they're in the beginning of their journey with chronic health. And if we're not careful, we might kind of reinforce that idea that there is something like the holy grail of wellness that can be achieved by everybody, and that the holy grail of wellness is to be abled in some way rather than disabled. And I do see the comment, thank you for the comment in the chat of, did you miss a holistic definition of disabled? No, you did not. And so the way I'm using the word disabled, and thank you for asking that question, the way I'm using the word disabled is really encompassing. It does include not just physical, but also kind of mental health issues, emotional issues. So there is an intersection, for example, between disability justice movement and the MAD movement. So folks with what are called psychiatric condition in our dominant culture, kind of reclaiming a connection with themselves beyond the pathological psychiatric model. It does include neurodivergence. It includes, and it includes also self-identification and self-definition. Not everybody who is chronically ill or lives with this disability identifies as disabled, but many people do. So when we're looking at those numbers that I was talking about earlier, like I said, those are people who are somehow categorized in this way through the medical model. And I'll talk a little bit later today about the medical model. But the number of people who are struggling in some way to live up to the standards set by capitalism because of their health issues is much higher. So to answer that question in the chat, it is a really encompassing definition, and it's also a self-identification and self-definition, if that makes sense. And that the way I'm talking about disability does include chronic health issues of any kind: physical, emotional, cognitive, spiritual, and so on. And so if we're not careful, when clients come to us, we risk kind of reproducing the same ableism that is encountered in dominant culture. And just in the same way that Resmaa Menakem in My Grandmother Sands talks about how the white body is the standard, we could say that it's not just the white body, it's the white cisgender abled body, and often male body, that it's a standard. And anything that deviates from that is seen as kind of deviant in some way. And we'll also talk about how the disability movement intersects with a lot of other movements because of that being seen as deviant in society. And we'll talk about that as well later in this webinar. And so one thing that has happened a lot to folks who are disabled or have chronic health issues is that they've encountered a lot of gaslighting by medical health and healthcare providers in general. So usually, if they're right at the beginning of their journey, maybe not yet, but most of us, especially those of us who might have less visible condition or less easily diagnosable condition, it took me 49 years to be rightly diagnosed with a connective tissue disorder after being misdiagnosed with fibromyalgia. So those of us who have those more syndromic, in SC terms, kind of conditions might have experienced years and years of gaslighting, years and years of being told that it's all in our head, or that it's just our trauma, all of that in air quotes. And so they might come to us tired, easily triggered, easily reactive, right? And so that's something that we need to bear in mind. How can we as somatic providers, and of course we'll come back to this towards the end, how can we avoid reproducing the same ableism that folks are encountering in their everyday life and not reproduce that in our healing spaces? Is that all making sense so far? Well, I don't know what the person who asked the question meant by spiritually disabled, but I would, if I had to give my own definition, I guess that for some folks, I know another one, that is not my identity or experience. So if somebody else wants to offer that definition, I would really encourage you to do that. So if Curtin, who asked the question, wants to give that definition in the chat, that would be great. The way I'm thinking about that is thinking about people who, might be classified, for example, as having a mental health condition under a Western model, but might actually feel that their health issues are kind of have a spiritual root, rather than kind of mental health. So for me, it's a matter of framing. What we might look in Western culture, for example, in mental health, a schizoaffective disorder might be looked through other cultural lenses as a spiritual disability of some kind. And like I said, that's my kind of understanding of that. But if other folks have other definitions, I really welcome you to put that in the chat as well. And thank you for asking questions as we go. I think it's so important, and language can be so different from community to community. That's really good to get some of those things clear. So that's why I think it's really important to talk about this within our community. And I've talked a little bit about how disabled folks and chronically ill folks might face a lot of gaslighting by healthcare providers. But beyond just healthcare providers, most disabled folks, and especially those of us who might have more visible disabilities, also face things like infantilization, desexualization, and vilification. And I'll go through what all of those things mean. And I'll also talk a little bit about why I've decided to focus on these three aspects in particular when thinking about working with disabled folks and challenging ableism within somatic practices. Great. Thank you for putting kind of your definition in the chat. I appreciate it. So with infantilization, what I mean is people are talking, for example, the most obvious is people talking to and treating disabled folks as if we were children, right? And so that taking away of agency. I've really noticed that once I started using a walker, for example, and also being older has been really interesting. I often joked that my age has finally caught up with my body. You know, I've been disabled since I was a child, but now my age kind of looks like congruent with some of the challenges I'm having. But since using a walker to get around a lot of the time, when I use a walker, people, including healthcare provider, speak a little slower to me. They also assume that I'm going to go slow, explain things in kind of simpler terms. There's almost kind of something that happens in people's minds when people use mobility aids of some kind, especially that immediately infantilizes people. Or adults with Down syndromes have also, you know, or autistic adults who use kind of modes like visual communication and who are non-speaking have also experienced this, right? So a lot of disabled folks have experienced being talked to and treated as if they were children. If you are out at a restaurant, for example, often people address with other folks. Waiters and other folks will talk to the folks who appear abled rather than talking directly to the disabled person. And they also often assume that the person who's with a disabled person is their carer. So for example, my bestie is deaf, and if we're out there and signing, but then I speak to the waiter for my order, the waiter will talk to me rather than my friend. Even to take their order. And again, it's the infantilization, assuming that an adult will not have a direct way to talk to them if they appear disabled in any way, right? And then more specific, there's also, and the reason why I want to talk about sex and sexuality a little bit as well, is because there is a really high rate of sexual trauma that disabled populations experience, including childhood sexual abuse, and especially for those disabled folks who might have been institutionalized in terms of residential schools and so on in the younger years. And so it is really important to talk about the impact of sexual assault and sexual abuse within disabled communities. And often people are coming to us to look for healing from that trauma. And so having an awareness that this is happening, while because of the infantilization, there is a lack of very limited sex education that most disabled folks receive, especially those of us who have been viewed as disabled from birth or from a young age. Is that all making sense so far? So overall, infantilization could be really summarized as not acknowledging or respecting disabled people's agency, independency, and sovereignty, right, over our bodies. And the lack of sovereignty, we also see in a lot of different ways. Like, for example, people grabbing wheelchairs, people grabbing my walker or touching it without asking for consent. And for a lot of disabled folks who use walkers or wheelchairs, it's an extension of our body. And so touching it or grabbing it, it's really as if you're touching or grabbing me without consent, right? But a lot of folks don't understand that and also don't see anything wrong with that. And so I know I'm really breaking it down, but it's encouraging to see in the chat that this is helpful. So thank you for the comments. So an aspect of infantilization is also desexualization. And like I said, I do want to talk a little bit about sex and sexuality because of the high rates of sexual trauma that disabled folks experience. And I'm talking about desexualization rather than asexualization because, of course, there are folks on the A spectrum within disabled communities. So asexual folks, aromantic folks exist within disabled communities. And if we talk about asexualization, then that erases those folks. And so when I'm talking about desexualization, I'm also trying to keep an eye on the chat to see if there's anything that, great. I love that people are putting comments in the chat. Thank you for doing that. So when I talk about desexualization, instead of a sexualization, to acknowledge the existence and validity of folks on the spectrum within our disabled community. But desexualization is basically the systemic divesting of sexual agency, autonomy, and erotic capital. What does that mean in practice? In practice, it means that as well as being seen as children, because we also conceive as children as not sexual being within dominant culture, disabled people are seen as children and therefore asexual, and often they're depicted as, being so brave or being angelic in some way, and often in disabled community that's referred to as inspiration porn. But a side of inspiration porn often includes an innocence that is being given to the disabled person, regardless of their sexual agency and autonomy. And the lack of and taking away the vesting of erotic capital means that within our dominant culture, these disabled people are often seen as unfuckable, in air quotes, so not having erotic capital, or as fetishes, such as in, I think it's the movie Crash, for example, and there are all communities, for example, that fetishize amputees. And again, I'm not going to go too much in detail into any community, but it's just to give an example of what that fetishizing can look like. And of course, sometimes it's consensual and fetishizing, but often it's not consensual fetishizing. And so there's either this impossibility of being sexual or the fetishizing of, or the vilification, which we'll talk about in a moment, of disabled folks. And of course, one of the most violent and systemic forms and manifestation of desexualization and also eugenics is the ongoing non-consensual sterilization of disabled people who have a uterus. So, and this is not a practice that has gone away. This still happens in the United States. It's not just happening in other countries. And part of it is this idea that, and especially for people with what is called intellectual disabilities in a kind of dominant world, they're often seen as not being able to understand, and therefore having caregivers or parents make the decision for them that they're going to be sterilized and that they should not reproduce. And until very recently, there were also laws against the reproduction of folks who were considered disabled in some way, especially in ways that were cognitive. And again, that could be its own kind of hour and a half. But eugenics, even though we think of as something in the past, is not really in the past for a lot of people. And that sterilization still happens often, and most often without the consent of the young people involved. I'm going to take a moment and have a look at the chat, because there's a lot that's happening in the chat, which is great. Yeah, there's some stuff about being gaslit, which we're going to come back to. What leads to this lack of consciousness? I mean, ableism, but we'll talk, the desexualization part is like, disabled children are innocent. They shouldn't be exposed to sex education. They don't need it, right? Because they're not seen as sexual. And of course, as well as sexual abuse, verbal, emotional, psychological, financial, spiritual abuse also happen. Absolutely. Lots of really good comments. What can we do as individuals? We'll get there. And yeah, and people also sharing their own experiences. I really appreciate all of that. And we're going to come back to all of that as well towards the end. I want to take a moment to just for you to check in what you're noticing in your body, your physical sensation, your thoughts, your emotions. Just what are you noticing right now before we even move on? And I'm going to give it a few breaths. And if you want to share in the chat how you're doing, you can do that. If you want to just notice it and also come back to a resource, you can do that if you need to do that. But again, with as much curiosity and non-judgment as you can, notice what is happening. Yeah, somebody say, I'm feeling heavy. And I really encourage you, if you haven't checked out Sense Invalid's work, check out more of their work and see nausea. Yeah, it's a lot. That's why I'm like, if you need your resource, use it, whatever resource you notice, repulsed. Yeah. How many of us from targeted and oppressed communities have to swallow labels and judgments in the same way, but also recognizing the list is much longer for those with disability we don't happen to have. That was very powerful. Found myself closing in, shoulders coming forward and down as the very things I received as negative messages, not always directly to me, but societal messages that make it scary to be your authentic self, feeling less grounded, almost queasy, tingles all over my body, very powerful, and my mind feels confused. I process info very slowly, and I'm feeling my invisible disability, oppression, heartful, watering eyes, warm from ribcage, radiating outward, grief. Thank you. Yes, I have to, whenever I use the snippet in presentations, I feel almost like I have to like ground myself like a tree not to, and sometimes I still cry, even though I've seen it so many times, because there is a lot in that snippet, right? And it's a lot about also all the various intersections of class and race and queerness. All of that is kind of in there. Left with the sensation that this is more than just disabled in our society. This is everyone who's considered an outcast or other. Yet all those intersections. Feeling sick to the stomach, relate to so much of this. I want to collapse and cry. This is why art is so powerful and dangerous to existing systems of oppression. Absolutely. And I think that art does take us to the body, right? It's so easy to stay with the numbers and the concepts and the intellectualization, but I was really hoping to bring us in the feeling of the impact of ableism on disabled folks, and especially Black and Brown disabled folks, and especially queer and trans disabled folks, right? All of those intersections where we know that all of the systems work together to impact. So I'm going to invite you to, do what you do to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Also really want to acknowledge that. Thank you for the comment that's like, it's a lot to process. Yes, I'm throwing a lot at you to process. And I'm so glad that this is going to be recorded. You're going to have access to the slides. It is a lot to take in. So please take care of yourselves. And right now, take in just what you can take in, and feel free to come back to the recording later. So I want to talk a little bit about the models of disability, right? So we talked about just how many disabled folks are there, why we need to talk about in terms of somatic practices. We're starting to touch into what ableism looks like on the day-to-day. But many of us, or all of us, we could say we're healthcare providers, healers of some kind. And so I think it is important to think about the models of disability for a moment. And this is really a very brief overview, because the models of disability in themselves, again, could be a whole other presentation. But the most familiar and pervasive model of disability is the medical model. And the medical model categorizes disability in kind of medical taxonomies. So, for example, terms like high functioning, low functioning for autistic folks is within the medical model, as well as a capitalist model, of course, because high functioning means being able to meet somehow, the pressure the capitalist society puts on us. And so terms like high functioning, low functioning are part of the medical model. Even the division of disability between physical, cognitive, emotional, sensory is within the medical model, right? It kind of cuts up the body in some way. Oh, thank you. Somebody's sharing a little dopamine playlist for those who need a quick reset. There's a little YouTube link. So if you need a little nervous system reset, there's a resource in the chat. Thank you for sharing that. So the medical model really sees disability and health as located in the individual person. And so disability within a medical model is a deficit, is a lack of something, right? Oh, I think that somebody is unmuted. So if you could mute yourself, that'd be great. Thank you. Even though it was lovely because I could hear birds in the background. And so the medical model is very individual. And it sees disability as a lack of health and as a deficit and as impairment. In the 1980s in particular, there is a pushback from actually starting in the 70s on, and then with disability studies in the 80s, there is a push towards a social model of disability. And a social model of disability places kind of flips it from the individual to society. And it basically says, if I use a wheelchair, I'm not disabled because I need to use a wheelchair. I'm disabled by the lack of ramps in our world. If I'm deaf and I'm a sign language user, I'm not disabled by my deafness. And also a lot of deaf people who are sign language users consider themselves a linguistic minority, as an aside, but I'm not disabled by my lack of hearing, but rather by other, hearing people, lack of knowledge of sign language, and so on. And there is in the kind of late 80s to early 90s, as the social model of disability becomes a little bit more visible and disability studies departments start to get established, there's a little bit of a pushback by feminist disabled scholars about the social model being almost like a swing to the other end. If you think about trauma as kind of all or nothing, right? On one end, we have medical trauma. And so the push then is to go completely social. Everything is about society. And feminist disabled scholars saying, on a minute, there's still the reality of the body, right? If for many of us whose disability also include pain, for example, yes, I am disabled by society, and also I need to deal with my body being in pain, right? And so feminist disabled scholar really push back on mostly cis white male scholars that start talking about the social model of disability and saying we need a model that is both social and it includes embodiment, where the model cannot be disembodied, because that's just a reaction to the medical model. And it's really important to understand the social model of disability. And yet, if we're not careful, we become disembodied, and the body is part of who we are and our experience. And so people like Jenny Moore and Sally French and Tracy and Potts here in the States write about this. And so it's very much, we're moving then towards the both end. And then in the early 2000s, we come to the disability justice framework that we'll talk about a little bit later. But I think it's important to give an overview about the different models of disability if you haven't come across it, because I think we often take, especially the medical model, for granted, right? This is how we talk about disability. This is how we categorize. This is how we break it down. But that is not the only way to look at disability. And again, another little snippet. This is Patty Burns and Stacey Milburn. Stacey is now an ancestor. She died at the beginning of the pandemic, I believe. And Patty is also one of the founders, we'll learn more, of Saints Invalid. And they talk about ableism in the snippet. And I thought, again, it would be much more powerful to really listen to them and their experiences of ableism rather than me telling you a lot about ableism. So I'm going to share this other short video.
So when I think about disability justice, I think about being a little girl and so many years spent walking instead of using a wheelchair, and like so many years spent thinking like, oh, how far do I have to walk until I sit down, or what am I going to do if I'm going to fall, or just feeling really, really concerned by physicality that when I started using a wheelchair, like instantly went away. And I was so shocked that for so long that wheelchair was thought to be this like the end of a good life. And really, it was the opposite, and it was so liberating. And people have use the word like wheelchair bound, and I found that it was really the opposite. Like I really got to be a kid once I started using a chair, or or I think about going to physical therapy 3 times a week and like being really resentful around why am I doing this? Is it like what's the purpose? Because I'm not interested in like this obsession with walking or having a straight head instead of a tilted head, or walking side to side instead of whatever, or all the being a young girl and doing all of these surgeries and feeling like, do these surgeries really benefit me? Why are they making me do this when it's really overall so insignificant? But again, things like a neck straightening surgery, you miss a whole summer of being a kid, and it's just so that your head looks straighter, and not really medically necessary. But
Wow.
but so much of that is around, like, I think about my mom and my dad being gone, and so she's a Korean mom with all of these white doctors, and then telling her she's not being a good mom if I don't do these surgeries. And is medicine about quality of life, or is it about like social control and perpetuating this idea of like a good body?
It's funny because people are like, "Oh, I'm so sorry that you're disabled," and it's absurd. I kind of want people to be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry that we live in ableism and I'm perpetuating it every day." Like, that's an appropriate thing to feel shitty about.
I think there's a political understanding of ableism as a system of oppression that favors able-bodiedness at any cost, frequently at the expense of people with disabilities. And I think ableism touches every aspect of life. Earlier, you were talking about internalized ableism and all of these values that people with disabilities adopt and carry shame, and it's like so heavy, such a heavy coat. And then I think there's ways ableism gets played out interpersonally between non-disabled people and people with disabilities. We know that the employment rate for people with disabilities has barely shifted over the last 40 years. We know so many people with disabilities are still locked away in institutions or in back rooms. So there's that interpersonal and systemic piece, and then also the institutional ableism. So what systems are in place that continually keep people with disabilities out? There's a lot of conversation to be had too, I think, about all the ways that ableism and racism and classism and heterosexism and all forms of oppression like really work together to keep people out.
I remember being little and being outside of a grocery store, and this is before the ADA, and there were these big poles to keep the shopping carts in, and that also kept people in chairs out. And so, people would tie their dogs on the poles, and I would, and I would like hang out with the dogs outside, because I couldn't go in the grocery stores, and I mean, that's what it looks like when you don't have access, right? Is you just get literally.
So that was a conversation between Patty Byrne, who was one of the co-founders of Since Invalid, with Lyra Moore, was one of the performers in the previous piece with Kara Page, and Stacey Milburn, both wonderful disability justice activists, and because Stacey is now beloved ancestor. And I really love this video because it encompasses so much in such a short conversation. And again, I don't know what you notice in your body. Again, it's so impactful because it's people talking about their experiences rather than just keeping it in kind of that prefrontal cortex intellectualizing realm, which I think can make us feel a little bit more detached, right? And both of those videos are on YouTube. The links are on the slides. And so you can also rewatch them if you want to later. And there's also continuing to be really good points in the chat as well around and people sharing their experiences. I'm gonna come back to all of this. Yes, and somebody saying Stacey Milburn, Alice Wong, and Mia Mingus writing on disability justice are absolutely great resources. Alice Wong has got the Disability Visibility Project and a wonderful anthology. Somebody else sharing their experiences, some deaf, hard of hearing, and now I have cochlear implants. I struggle because sometimes I feel like we're spending so much time trying to be treated normal when in fact, without hearing aids, I would need a lot of help. I'm not normal and I do need help, and I've accepted that I can't expect society to constantly conform to my needs, and language the same way. They also cannot keep up with all the new languages and proper acknowledgements that it requires. I always found that asking questions and remaining teachable is very important. Oh, hang on. So much happening in this chat that is like, it's very important, but I also know that I love who I am, no matter if I'm accepted or not. I know we're talking about this on a larger platform, but as a person with as a disability, I feel we're entering a world where we're all fighting to be equal without acceptance that we're not, because we do not, in fact, need help and support. I love that, yes, a lot of those points are like the both and, right? It's like both society and also our own experiences. As I grow in age, I know this is social pressure around how agile I appear, how to appear. There's a constant spotlight and a judgment that is almost shaming and even more disabling. Absolutely. And what I love about, so thank you for all of you who are sharing your experiences so beautifully and vulnerably in the chat. I really appreciate you. And again, what I like about this piece, it talks about the pressure of the good body, right? And the favoring of the good body, in air quotes, at any cost, right? When Stacey talks about a whole summer of not being a kid, just so that my head can appear straight, which has really no medical advantage apart from looking as I'm supposed to be looking according to societal standards, right? And if we're not careful, slides, and if we're not careful within our somatic practices, we can reproduce this idea of the good body, right? How many of our clients who are maybe at the beginning of their health journey or were in a lot of pain just want all of that to go away, right? Whether it's realistic or not. And so if we're not careful, we might become kind of purveyors, I think is the word I'm looking for, of this idea of the good body within healing spaces. So I really want to shift to talking about somatic practices and ableism. Stacey in the video really did a good job also on touching on different types of ableism, right? Institutional, interpersonal, but also internalized ableism and different forms of ableism in the conversation with Patty. And so I really want us to think about our somatic practices and how these different types of ableism might manifest. And again, we're going to just really touch on it, but this is an invitation to all of us to really think more about how pervasive ableism can be in the everywhere, in all our interactions, but also in our somatic spaces. So for example, if I think about it in institutional level, one of the things that I found really pretty challenging when I was partaking in my SC training, which I loved, I'm really proud to be an SCP and I love my somatic experiencing training, but it was absolutely grueling on my body. There didn't seem to really be any consideration of how physically demanding something like SC training is. And that, of course, you can always step out, but if you step out, you're missing a chunk, right? And so even things like, where does the training take place? Is it an accessible space and accessible in a number of ways? Our access needs addressed in, sure, maybe, sign language interpreters are provided, but what about the interactions with other colleagues, other students, for example, during break time, right? Are the interpreters, are there enough interpreters that are being paid to also hang out during breaks, during lunchtime, so that if there is a deaf person taking part in the training, they can also talk to other people? Does the training need to be that long? Could it be a little bit longer, one day longer, but maybe a little bit shorter with more breaks? So these are just examples, but physically it is very demanding. And often when we think about access, we're just thinking about some basic boxes like there's an accessible bathroom, there's a ramp, there's an elevator, tick, 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 right? But are we truly thinking about what is it like to run an inclusive training that is accessible to many different types of bodies? Or are we standardizing it according to an able body and then asking any disabled folks who are taking the training to kind of adapt, right? And that's a question to ask ourselves whenever we work, and it's even our way of working with ourselves and our colleagues sustainable for everybody, or is it only sustainable for certain bodies, right? So that's just one type of ableism, that kind of institutional, always set up our systems. And then, of course, there's interpersonal, right? What happens in our interactions with one another, right? What happens, when somebody kind of grabs a walker or says things like Patty's example, I'm sorry you're disabled. I've had a lot of people recently, because it's fairly new, having to use a walker. I've been using a cane for a couple of years, and then I had to transition to using a walker. And I know that at some point I'm gonna have to use a wheelchair more frequently. I started using it some of the time. And there's a lot of like, I'm so sorry, but like Stacy, like for me, it's freeing. Okay, I can walk, 3 minutes with a cane, or I can walk 20 minutes with a walker, and I can sit down, and so in those interpersonal interaction, how are we placing ourselves, whether we're disabled or not, right? Because there's also that piece of internalized ableism, right? How hard it is sometimes for some of us to come to terms with some of the limitations of the body, right? How are those interpersonal interactions that are happening with clients, with students, with colleagues? How are they informed by our own positionality? And that's definitely one of the questions that I'm going to invite you to think about a little bit more at the end of the training or of the webinar. And of course, ableism doesn't always look hostile, right? That's just one form of ableism, right? Somebody saying something, somebody using the R word, which apparently it's in vogue again amongst young people, much to the dismay of my older kid, for example. That's an example of really hostile ableism, right? Name calling. And so that's just one manifestation. But ableism can also be benevolent, right? Oh, let me do this for you. Part of that benevolence is assuming what other people need. And then often it goes from benevolent to hostile pretty quickly, right? If somebody is, oh, let me help you get through this, crossroad, and pushes somebody else's wheelchair without consent, it goes from benevolent, I want to help you, to hostile pretty quickly if the disabled person then reacts quite readily as being treated as having no consent and says, get your hands off me, and they're like, I'm only touching your chair. I was only trying to help. Why are you being so difficult? And I'm giving some of the more obvious examples because they're so at our fingertips, but there could be so many examples of both hostile and benevolent ableism. And because benevolent ableism can turn hostile so quickly, because often we have an expectation of oppressed people always presenting themselves as palatable, as Kara Page said in the earlier theater piece. Ambivalent ableism is that kind of starts benevolent but turns hostile pretty quickly, or vice versa, right? Again, lots of happening in the chat. I love it. This is such a engaged group. Thank you. Oh yes, the artwork is great. It's actually from a disability project, which it's disabled artist, disabled in here artist, and it's freely available online. Somebody else agreeing that's physically brutal, the training, even though we love it, demanding, and also on those who have experienced significant trauma, again, which is like, it's not just about our body is not just our physical body, it's also our emotions, our nervous system. Having to request closed captioning for virtual presentation out of time and still not getting access to it. Great example of institutional ableism. One way ableism manifests for a lot of disabled folks is medical and mental health care providers not believing our experiences or diagnosis, or needing to prove how disabled we are in order to get our access met. Absolutely. Patronization, another great example. I love how this video offers a glimpse into the extra energy, time, and heart-body space that is expanded in relation to living in an ableist world, especially medically. It is also important to know and remember that people are living with disability expand immense amounts of all the above that is very invisible and valued labor, such as filling out forms constantly just for existing, medical appointments, self-care appointments, not validated as medical, but necessary for maintaining body and mind, like massage therapy, mental health support, advocating for government and medical insurance supports. Even when the policies say you should receive the support, there are still invisible barriers. Gatekeeping, absolutely. That's so much good stuff there. This is not an exhaustive list. I'm sorry I didn't read it all out. And I live in Canada. And somebody else agreeing, yes, the amount of paperwork and doctor's notes required to get approved for SSDI is oppressive. Absolutely. So much of this, right? So ableism is super pervasive. And I really want to encourage you to think about how often as somatic providers, we might still believe in the good body, in air quotes, right? And so how can we frame, instead of thinking about the good body, thinking about being in, having a relationship with ourselves, right? What if we were helping our clients having a loving, caring, compassionate relationship with themselves, wherever kind of our bodies are at. So again, so much to cover. I want to kind of touch back on disability justice. I mentioned it earlier. Sorry, I get super dry when I present. In the early 2000s, we go from not just the social model and the feminist critiques of the social models of disability, but in a conversation mostly among women of color and other trans and queer folks like Eli Clare, Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, and so on, this framework of disability justice emerges. And disability justice has 10 principles, which we're not going to have the time to go into depth, but I just want to name them because I think their principles are really healing for all of us who work with trauma, right? So intersectionality, leadership of those most impacted, anti-capitalism, cross-movement organizing, wholeness, sustainability, cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. So disability justice is no longer about, is the disability in the individual, is the disability in the social system, but disability justice really calls us to really live by that principle of none of us are free until all of us are free, and to really kind of center like the leadership of the most impacted, really consider how capitalism is impacting our health. Wonderful. Somebody has already put the link to the 10 principles of disability justice in the chat. I love it. Thank you. And so I really encourage you to kind of go and read more about them and sit with them. And like I said, that, you know, we would need 2 or 3 hours to go through all the principles, but have a moment to really think about how compatible those principles of a disability justice framework, how compatible those principles are with healing from trauma. Just take that in for a moment, right? How compatible is interdependence and wholeness and sustainability with healing from trauma, right? For me, it's like such a guide in my work. And so I really invite you to kind of check them out. So some final thoughts before I open it up for questions, as promised. One of the foundational, I would say, principles, and one of the 10 principles really is recognizing wholeness, right? But what can recognizing wholeness mean within our somatic practices? Well, first of all, it means challenging pathologization. It's a really hard word for me to pronounce, sorry. Challenging pathologization within our field, right? And that still very much exists. I remember being at advanced and people talking about syndromic folks and folks who had a lot of chronic health issues and disability, and how some of them can be reactive. And some people were still framing this as borderline personality disorder, which is a very pathological way of looking at somebody's behavior rather than looking at it through a lens of trauma and through a lens of disability justice, right? So challenging pathologization is so important, I think, in our field. And recognizing all body minds as valid. As healers, are we trying to facilitate people getting to the good body, in air quotes, as Stacey called it in the video, or are we really supporting our clients to embrace the validity and beauty and capacity of their body minds, wherever their body minds are at? And body mind is term that started to be used in disability justice. I think Sami Shock and Margaret, it's escaping me her name, but used the term body minds to challenge the Western dualism of separation from body and mind. And in order to recognize all body minds as valid, and whole, we really need to recognize the influence that ableism has in our everyday practices. And in our life, as well as in dominant culture. And finally, I'm going to really encourage you to think how understand that if we are to heal from trauma, we need to include challenging ableism within our field. We need to work on including all systems of oppressions and challenging all different types of systemic trauma, but often kind of disability can be left behind, and it does intersect with all the other justices that we're trying to work with. You know, disability absolutely intersects with racial justice that we're looking for, with gender justice, right? All of those are connected, as I hope the work of the folks from Sins Invalid have illustrated. So when I say that we need to change our thinking, not just our practice, I really mean that we need to unlearn so much of what we've learned from dominant culture about what is a good body, in air quotes, about what is a body that is desirable in every term, not just sexually, but also in healing terms, right? And one of the other principles of disability justice is that no body is disposable. And so I'm really going to invite you to imagine what would it look like if no body was disposable within Somatic Experiencing International, on a training level, on an interpersonal level with colleagues, in your work with your clients. And what are the things that we need to unlearn to truly embrace this idea that no body is disposable? And so I'm going to leave you with some potential questions for reflections before we open it up to questions. And some of the questions and these are just questions for reflections, if they're useful. If not, feel free to just ignore them. But some of the things you might want to think about is, how might your own positionality influence the way you approach disabled clients, colleagues, and students? And again, whether we are disabled or not, right? And so how does that positionality influence those relationships? What assumptions do you notice yourself making in those interactions with disabled clients, colleagues, and students? How do you notice ableism showing up in your practice? And what do you imagine the goal of somatic practices to be when working with disabled clients? And I think that's an important one, right? What is it that we're doing in a healing context when we accept that no body is disposable? So thank you so much for your time. Feel free to email me or check out my website or follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you so much for your attention and cooperation with everything that you shared in the chat. I am going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see you all and I can see the chat more easily. And I'm going to see what's in, I think I've missed a bunch of stuff that was happening in the chat towards the end. But we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to find some more water around me. I hope this was helpful and as clear as it can be when I'm trying to cover a lot in 90 minutes. I know some people had to leave early, so I'm glad this was recorded. Thank you. Yeah, some great comments about living with disability is a part-time job. Absolutely. I do often talk about how actually living with a disability is my full-time job. I still have to survive under capitalism. Because also being disabled is like expensive, quite frankly, because a lot of access actually, and that's where that class and financial access piece comes in, right? And the disability, usually folks who live on disability benefits often live in poverty or below poverty line. Recommendation for books, I'll put together a handout of resources to go with the slides, and I'll send it to SEI. Somebody else, yes, I could do a webinar on why BPD is a diagnosis that needs to just expire and never be used again. Lots of thank yous. That's very sweet. Questions? I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything in the chat. And if it is easier or more accessible to unmute yourself, please do. That's a great idea. Can we save the chat? Yes, I believe we can. We'll make sure we save the chat before exiting. In terms of resources, while other people formulate questions, because I don't see any other questions, I do really encourage you to check out the Sins Invalid website, all the Sins Invalid videos on YouTube. Alice Wong, Disability Visibility Project is wonderful. Alice has also got a really wonderful anthology on disabled lives with a lot of different contributors. From a lot of different backgrounds. There's also Mia Minga's work. And Mia Mingas has a blog and has done really wonderful work on various aspects of disability, including the concept of access intimacy, which as a family therapist and sex therapist, I use often. And I will put all of those resources in the handouts that I send with the slides. I don't get a sense about this related to SE practices. Absolutely. So as a somatic experiencing practitioner, as well as thinking institutionally, what the barriers might be, for example, to more disabled people training. Think about your training. How many visibly disabled people were in your training? How many of your colleagues you know if they're disabled or not? When a client comes to you as a somatic experiencing practitioner and is in a lot of pain and just wants the pain to go away, if they have a condition where the pain is not going to go away, are you offering them a framework like ableism to better understand why they might be experiencing some of the barriers they're experiencing? Or are you just trying to, or are you just supporting this fantasy of the good body, as Stacey called it, right? Do you understand the level of gaslighting that people with chronic health issues that we categorize as syndromic and somatic experiencing might have experienced before getting to you as a provider? Do you think of some chronic health issue as just the consequence of trauma, in air quotes, and not really consider what might be going on really a systemic level for the person in terms of impact on organs, for example? I mean, I've been lots of somatic providers who are like, yes, let's work with your pain as part of trauma, but nobody was like, do you have a good doctor? Have you given up on medical providers? What does the diagnosis open up or close down, right? So in terms of how it relates to SC practices, I think it's really pervasive, right? It starts from, where are all the disabled providers in SC? There are a few. Why are they not very vocal? Also, for example, for me in the mental health field, a lot of therapists don't like to talk about disability, especially if they're mental health issues, because, you know, they show being an impaired provider, in air quote. What does it mean to be an impaired provider in mental health, right? Who gets to decide who's an impaired provider? You know, from an abled perspective, that makes a lot of disabled therapists really afraid to speak up, right? Do we know as SC providers how to talk to autistic clients, right? Or do we only know how to talk to neurotypical clients? I don't know, the list is long. I can keep giving examples. Also, if other people think of examples, please put them in the chat. I want to make sure that I'm not missing other questions. so much in the chat. This is great. Oh, yes, somebody made a comment, being trained in other modality that are very rooted in the medical model, and also, for example, mentioning ABA, applied behavioral analysis, which is considered by many autistic folks a form of conversion therapy, and yet is still what a lot of educators and therapists are trained in. And I've met somatic providers who are mental health providers who did not understand that ABA is actually traumatic for autistic folks. Yes, ABA is applied behavioral analysis. Do you have a list of self-advocacy tools that are helpful? Oh, that would be a whole other 90 minutes. I will rack my brain today and see if I can think of good self-advocacy tools. That is a great question. So let me make a note of that. And ABA is absolutely, so applied behavioral analysis is absolutely rooted in eugenics. And self-advocacy tools, right, made a note of that. What else am I missing? Oh, when a client comes with prolonged depression, despite clarity, unable to focus on practices we discuss and agree, the challenge of making them discipline or do a follow-through. Absolutely. And that's another, right? What are we trying to do as somatic experiencing provider when we're faced with folks who are disabled in any way? Are we trying to get them to come back to normal, whatever dominant society is considering normal, or are we trying to support them to meet themselves and where they're at? Are we supporting coherence? And what does coherence look like for certain system, right? And are you interpreting coherence in the nervous system from your perspective, if you're able, or even if you're disabled in some way, but not in the same way as the client? Or are you really thinking about what coherence could look like from a disability justice framework? So coherence might actually look like somebody deciding to work 20 hours a week rather than a full 40 hours a week, and supporting that as a provider. Coherence might look like actually being angry with the medical system and looking for a different provider, and so on. Absolutely. So there's so much to talk about and so many wonderful comments. Yes, please, let's save the chat. Yes, emphasis in trainings on visual cues and using sight. Absolutely. I always make sure that I read everything on my slides, but I'm still not very good. I didn't describe myself, and I didn't describe the pictures on the slides, for example, today. So there you go, the example of ableism right there. I was not very accessible in terms of visual access. And, it is so easy. Ableism really is like the air we breathe. I'm still trying to eradicate ableist language, ableist practices, like not describing absolutely everything that's on a slide, not just content, not describing myself. I should have described what I look like for folks who are visually impaired. So don't be discouraged if it feels really big. It is a really big endeavor to challenge ableism in our practices. And this is just like planting a seed. And I hope that maybe we can continue the conversation another time and really go deeper now that we got the basics, go kind of really deeper into what does it look like to apply a disability justice framework within SE. Alrighty, so I'm noticing time. Thank you for all your wonderful comments. If there's a very brief question, I can grab that question. But otherwise, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for all the wonderful comments. I'm sorry if we didn't quite, if you didn't feel like this lived up to the description. I really tried to go by my learning objectives, but I also know that I was covering a lot of stuff. And so I wish there was even more time to talk about all of this. Thank you so much. And hopefully the resources that I'll follow up with will be helpful.